All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into a sermon that a listener sent us called Get Serious About Your Marriage. And this is from a minister in the Living Church of God. And for some folks that might not be familiar with that group, they're sort of an offshoot of Armstrongism, which is considered a non-Christian cult. So we're going to kind of unpack some of the things in this sermon and see how it compares to traditional Christianity.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This sermon uses a lot of familiar Bible passages, but it kind of layers in interpretations that might surprise some people.
Right. Like the whole using Ecclesiastes to say that the day of someone's death is better than their birthday. We'll get to that later, but for now. I think it's helpful to start with some background on Armstrongism itself. Can you give us a little rundown on that?
Sure. Armstrongism was started by Herbert W. Armstrong, and it has this unique theology that differs quite a bit from mainstream Christianity. One of the main differences is their belief in something called British Israelism.
British Israelism. That sounds interesting.
It is. It's the idea that the British and American people are actually descendants of the lost tribes of Israel.
Wow.
And that plays a major role in their prophecies about the end times.
I see. So that ties into like a whole eschatology.
Exactly. And they also have a strong emphasis on following Old Testament laws and rituals.
Like what kind of things?
So they observe the Sabbath on Saturday. They follow certain dietary restrictions, things that most Christian denominations today don't typically practice.
So it's like a blending of Old Testament law with New Testament.
Yeah, they kind of create their own unique system of beliefs. And it impacts their understanding of salvation, too.
Oh.
They emphasize obedience to these laws as essential for staying saved.
That's more of a works-based salvation.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a contrast to mainstream Christianity, where salvation is typically seen as a gift from God, received through faith in Jesus Christ.
Right. So kind of like adding requirements to grace.
Exactly. It's all about context.
So let's get into the sermon. It starts with this story about the minister meeting new students who all claim to be like the best class ever.
Yeah, and he uses this anecdote to springboard into talking about boasting and the importance of finishing well spiritually.
He brings up some Bible passages to support that.
Yeah, like the 2 Corinthians 10:12, where Paul talks about not comparing ourselves to others.
Makes sense.
And he tells that story about King Ben-Hadad from 1 Kings 20, who like boasts before battle and ends up losing.
Ooh, yeah. Pride comes before the fall. So he's setting a pretty serious tone from the start. But I'm curious about this finishing well idea. Is that like a big thing in Armstrongism?
It is. It's a recurring theme. It ties into their belief that God is working to establish his kingdom on earth, and only those who remain faithful to the very end will be part of it.
That's pretty different from how most Christian denominations see it, right?
It is, yeah. In traditional Christianity, salvation is seen as a gift. Once you're saved, even if you make mistakes along the way.
Right, but it sounds like in Armstrongism, there's this constant fear of losing your salvation if you don't follow the rules perfectly.
Exactly. It creates this focus on law-keeping rather than on having a relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, more about earning God's favor than receiving his grace.
That's a good way to put it.
And that kind of sets the stage for how he uses these Old Testament stories and laws in the rest of his message.
Right. There's a real sense of legalism, this belief that you earn salvation by following rules and regulations.
Okay, so he then goes on to talk about King Saul and Solomon as examples of leaders who kind of messed up after a strong start.
Yeah, he points out how Saul disobeyed God in 1 Samuel 15 and how Solomon strayed from God by marrying foreign wives and following their idols. That's in 1 Kings 11.
Right, and he's using these as cautionary tales.
Yeah, basically saying even those who start well can lose their salvation if they're not careful.
So he's not exactly painting a rosy picture of the Christian life.
It's definitely a more fear-based approach than what you find in many other Christian traditions.
Then he brings in the parable of the sower from Matthew 13.
Yeah.
That's a pretty well-known parable about different responses to the word of God, right?
Yeah, but he gives it his own twist.
In what way?
He focuses on the seeds that fall on stony ground and among thorns, and he interprets them as representing people who start out strong in their faith, but they fall away because of persecution or worldly distractions.
Interesting. I mean, in traditional Christian teaching, that parable is often seen as a warning against shallow faith or allowing the cares of the world to choke out the word. But he seems to be emphasizing separation from the world entirely.
Right, and that aligns with Armstrongism's teachings. They believe the world is inherently corrupt, and true Christians must live separately from it.
So it's not just about resisting temptation. It's about creating a wall between yourself and the world.
Exactly. And that isolation can sometimes lead to some unhealthy dynamics.
Makes sense. So then he makes this kind of unexpected shift,
Yeah.
connecting these ideas about spiritual stamina to the topic of marriage.
Yeah, he draws a parallel between starting strong spiritually and building a marriage on the right foundation.
Why does he do that?
Well, in Armstrongism, marriage and family are really important. They see them as central to God's plan and crucial for establishing his kingdom on earth.
Okay, so strong families equal.
Strong foundation for God's kingdom.
Gotcha. He uses these examples of the kings messing up and the parable about the seeds to caution against complacency in marriage.
Right, emphasizing the need for constant effort and a strong foundation from the beginning.
So he's basically saying that just like your spiritual life, your marriage needs constant vigilance.
And obedience to God's laws.
And this is where we're going to start to see some of the unique and potentially controversial aspects of Armstrongism's teachings on marriage.
Exactly. He's going to unpack what he sees as the pitfalls of marriage and how to build a lasting union based on biblical principles, as interpreted through the lens of Armstrongism.
This is where things might get really interesting.
Yeah, we'll definitely see some teachings that deviate from mainstream Christian views. Okay, so he dives right in and outlines a bunch of reasons why he thinks marriages fail. First on the list is what he calls building on a poor foundation.
Makes sense.
He talks about choosing a partner without seeking counsel from family and friends, and he pulls out some verses from Proverbs to back that up.
Yeah, I mean, seeking wisdom from others before making such a big decision. That's good advice in any situation, really.
Right, but in Armstrongism, there's a specific emphasis on getting counsel from people who share their faith.
So it's about keeping the faith pure, even when it comes to choosing a spouse.
Exactly. They see marriage not just as a union between two people, but as a spiritual partnership.
That strengthens the community of believers.
Right. Very much an us versus them mentality.
Okay, so what else is on his list of marriage pitfalls?
Next up, he warns against ignoring warning signs in a potential partner.
Like what?
Overlooking character flaws, behavioral issues, maybe getting swept up in infatuation, or physical intimacy.
Yeah, that can definitely cloud your judgment.
He even quotes 1 Corinthians 6.18, which urges believers to flee from sexual immorality.
Right, that's a pretty standard Christian teaching.
Yeah, but it takes on even greater weight in Armstrongism.
How so?
They believe that sexual sin, even during courtship, can have serious spiritual consequences.
It's about maintaining purity.
Yeah, and not being unequally yoked with an unbeliever.
So he's setting a very high bar.
For behavior before marriage.
Yeah, prioritizing spiritual compatibility over everything else.
And that ties back to their legalistic view of salvation.
Right, it's not enough to just have faith in Christ. You got to demonstrate your worthiness through strict obedience.
To God's laws.
Including those related to purity in marriage.
Exactly.
Okay, so then he moves on to
selfishness and pride.
As major problems in marriage.
Yeah, he pulls out some familiar verses like Philippians 2.1-8, encouraging humility and putting others' needs first.
Those are pretty solid principles for any relationship.
He also quotes Proverbs, linking pride to strife and conflict.
So emphasizing selflessness and serving your spouse.
Right, which echoes traditional Christian teachings.
Yes.
About love and sacrifice in marriage.
But I'm curious, how does this idea of selflessness play out within the specific roles and expectations that they emphasize in marriage?
It's a good question.
Okay.
And that's where things get a bit more tricky.
Okay, weigh in on me.
His next point is all about what he sees as rejecting God's ordained roles for husbands and wives.
Here we go.
This is where we start to see some real divergence from how many Christian denominations view marriage today.
So he's talking about the traditional view of the husband as the head of the household and the wife as submissive.
He cites Genesis 2 and Ephesians 5.
That's his support that view. And, you know, a lot of Christian denominations today emphasize mutual submission and partnership in marriage.
Recognizing the equality of men and women before God.
But Armstrongism sticks to a more hierarchical structure.
Yeah, based on their interpretation of those biblical passages.
So the husband is the leader.
And the wife is supposed to submit and obey.
And this view has drawn criticism, especially considering the allegations surrounding Herbert W. Armstrong's own marital life.
You're talking about
his second wife divorcing him.
Amidst accusations of incest.
Yeah. It's a really complicated history.
That raises questions about how these principles were practiced in the founder's own life.
It's definitely important to acknowledge that context.
And to consider the potential for unhealthy power dynamics
Yeah.
within a system that prioritizes unquestioning obedience.
It's a sensitive topic
but one that we can't ignore
when discussing these teachings.
Absolutely. It's crucial to be aware of the potential for abuse or control whenever you're dealing with teachings that promote rigid hierarchies and unquestioning obedience.
All right, so let's keep exploring this idea of God's ordained roles in marriage. It seems like he's building towards a very specific model.
Yeah, he's not a fan of the modern idea of a 50-50 marriage.
What does he propose instead?
He advocates for what he calls a 100-100 approach.
So no meeting in the middle?
Nope. He thinks that in a 50-50 marriage, people inevitably fall short, which leads to resentment and disappointment.
So by committing 100% to your God-given role,
you eliminate those negotiations.
And just focus on fulfilling your duty.
Exactly.
But doesn't that put a lot of emphasis on following rules and fulfilling obligations?
It does.
Even if it comes at the expense of
individual happiness or the health of the relationship. That's a valid concern.
What happens when one partner isn't holding up their end?
Right. What does 100% commitment look like when one person is giving their all and the other is taking advantage or being abusive?
It seems like this model could trap people.
In unhealthy situations.
Yeah.
Healthy relationships require mutuality, respect, and a balance of giving and receiving.
It's not about blind obedience to a rigid set of rules.
Regardless of the cost.
Okay, so then he tries to justify this hierarchical model.
Yeah.
By talking about why God created men and women so differently.
Right. He suggests it's all part of God's plan.
And that true happiness in marriage comes from embracing those differences.
It's a common argument in what's often called complementarian theology,
which emphasizes the distinct roles of men and women.
But Armstrongism takes it a step further.
By connecting it to their beliefs about God's plan for establishing his kingdom on earth.
Right. They see it as essential for fulfilling that larger plan.
So we've seen how he builds this case for a very specific model of marriage.
Rooted in Armstrongist teachings.
About obedience, God's ordained roles, and 100% commitment.
And he tries to tie all of that back to the bigger picture of spiritual growth and preparation for God's kingdom.
He's coming full circle.
Exactly. He concludes by saying that marriage should be taken seriously and used as training ground to develop godly character.
He talks about qualities like outgoing concern, patience, humility, and obedience.
Yet how those things have eternal implications.
For those seeking to be part of God's kingdom.
He even quotes Galatians 5 to connect this idea of character development to the fruits of the Spirit.
So it's not just about having a happy marriage.
It's about using marriage to earn a place in God's kingdom.
Wow. So he's presented a pretty compelling narrative.
He's woven together biblical passages, personal anecdotes, and even controversial sources.
This message that might resonate with some people.
But it's essential to listen with a discerning ear.
Right.
And think critically about what's being said.
Yeah, this is a good reminder that religious teachings, even those that seem positive on the surface, can have unintended consequences. Right. We need to be aware of the potential for harm.
Especially when dealing with groups that emphasize rigid roles, unquestioning obedience, and the fear of losing your salvation.
You know, it's interesting how he frames marriage not just as a source of personal happiness, but almost like a spiritual assignment.
Yeah, that's a key element of Armstrongism. They see this life as a test, you know? Like you have to prove your faithfulness and obedience through strict adherence to God's laws and fulfilling your assigned role.
Right, like it's all part of this bigger plan.
Exactly, and marriage is a vital part of that preparation, in their view.
He even compares a husband's love for his wife to Christ's love for the church. He talks about self-sacrifice and putting her needs above his own, but then he immediately links it back to fulfilling that God-given role.
Right, it's almost like acts of love are just part of the job description.
Yeah, it's a unique blend of those traditional Christian ideas about love and sacrifice. With this strong emphasis on obedience and fulfilling a predetermined plan, it makes you wonder if love in this context is truly selfless, or if it's driven by a desire to please God and secure your spot in his kingdom.
It's a good question. I mean, reducing love to a set of rules or a way to earn spiritual points can create a very transactional view of relationships.
Right, it takes away the emotional aspect.
And it can overshadow the emotional needs of individuals.
Yeah, we need to check our motivations and make sure our actions come from a place of genuine love and respect, not just a desire to check off boxes or score points with God.
Absolutely. That's a valuable takeaway for anyone, regardless of their beliefs.
Yeah.
We should approach relationships authentically and be willing to grow and learn with our partners, not just try to fit into predefined roles or expectations.
So we've explored this sermon's message about marriage. We've unpacked the key points, compared them to traditional Christianity, and looked at how they fit within the teachings of Armstrongism. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Full of interesting insights and thought-provoking questions.
Definitely shows how important it is to look at religious teachings with a critical eye.
We need to consider their historical context, potential biases, and most importantly, their impact on people's lives.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider. This sermon focused on a very specific model for marriage, one that emphasizes obedience, fulfilling preordained roles, and 100% commitment. But it makes you wonder, what does a healthy, fulfilling, and spiritually grounded relationship look like to you?
That's a great question. Maybe something to explore with your partner, your community, or even in quiet reflection.
As you consider different viewpoints and teachings, remember to prioritize respect, communication, and above all, the well-being of everyone involved.
That's so important.
And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. Thank you for joining us. We hope this exploration encourages you to continue seeking knowledge and understanding, may lead to greater compassion and more meaningful connections in your own life